Morning to all. Good morning to all. God is good. God continues to be good to us. Thankful for this opportunity that we can come together to share the word of God this morning. And I trust that something would be said this morning that will indeed encourage you and cause you to have a deeper relationship with God. I want to thank Brother Ronald for his kind introduction this morning and his wonderful singing as well this morning. If you're taking notes this morning, I've entitled this message, Bitten but not defeated. Bitten but not defeated. Bitten but not defeated. I want to thank Brother Alejandro for ably reading the scriptures this morning in his tune. If you look at the passage in Acts 28, but before you do that, I just want to do some background checks in the book of Acts 27. And I want you to look at verse number 37 firstly. Acts 27. And I want you to look at verse number 37. In Acts 27 and verse 37, it says that, and we were all in the ship, 216 souls. Now you read in the next chapter that this ship had been shipwrecked. So I want you to know that there's 276 passengers that are on the ship. Now, if we continue in this Acts 27, I just want to look at verses number 42 to verses number 44. The same Acts 27. Look at verse number 42 down to verse number 44. It says, and the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to the land, and the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped, all safe to land. What was happening here is that the ship was indeed shipwrecked. And the Syrian soldiers, because they couldn't let any prisoner escape, they were going to kill everybody. But Paul, notice that it says here in verse number 42 to verse number 44, Paul, who having found favor with one of the centurion soldiers, he convinced the rest to not kill anybody. And he saw those who can swim, you can swim. And everybody was able to make it safely to the land. So because of the favor of God on Paul's life, it resulted in favor and blessings on the other prisoners. Wow. You know, we see this in the life of Joseph in Potiphar's house. He recognized that anything that Joseph did, he was blessed. Even in Potiphar's house, he recognized himself that, hey, this man is indeed a blessing. Daniel, as well, same thing, blessing anything that he did. And it's interesting to know that if you are a child of God, that you bring blessings to those around you. In your job, you know, one commentator said, he tells the boss that you need to have me around because you can recognize that I'm blessed. And because I'm blessed, this job is blessed. What a wonderful thought to know. As believers, we are not without trials, however, and tests in life. Some Christians believe that once you're saved, every day is Sunday. But sorry to burst your bubble. It's not like that. And we see that even here in the life of Paul. Paul is indeed blessed, but shipwrecked. And, in the book of Psalms 34 and verse 19 says that many are the afflictions of the righteous. He says, but the Lord delivered them out of them all. And of course, 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12 says that, yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus, he says, shall suffer persecution. So just because we are facing challenges doesn't mean that we are out of the will of God. But those are just side things. I want to go into the main lesson now in Acts chapter number 28. Verse number 1 and verse number 2 says this. When they were escaped, then they knew the island was called Melita, and the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us everyone because of the present rain and because of the cold. Firstly, I want us to recognize that they arrived at this island, Melita. Some translations, you'll see the word Malta. It's a little island that is northern Africa, between northern Africa and Italy. And the time it would have been under Roman occupation. It's about 60 miles south of Sicily, and the island itself is about 18 miles wide and 9 miles long. And interesting, the word Malta means a place of refuge. A place of refuge. The first thing I notice in this text that people are kind when they don't need to be. People are kind when they don't need to be. This was a ship full of 276 prisoners. Paul and the other prisoners arrived on this island of Malta, or crashed on this island of Malta. The Bible, or the King James Version, that says that they kindled a fire, and he says they showed us no little kindness. The people were very kind. The text calls them barbarians, but this does not depict their behavior, because the text says that they were kind people. The word barbarian would suggest or depict their language. It was a reference to the people there, that they did not speak the same language as Paul and the other prisoners. The text says that they kindled a fire as they welcomed them into this community of people. This suggests to me that people don't have to be kind to you, but we certainly ought to be appreciative when they are. Now, I want you to recognize the magnitude of this fire. Now remember, if you read in verse number 1, now they were wet because the ship had crashed. Those who could swim had to swim across to meet the island. And then it says here in verse number 1, in verse number 2, the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us everyone because of the present rain and because of the cold. So they are kindling this fire in rain and in cold weather. And to make matters worse, in verse number 12 and the same 28, it says in verse number 11, after 3 months we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isles, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. So it's in the winter. It's cold. It's raining. The prisoners are wet. And it's 276 of them. So that's a massive task to kindle a fire, to be able to warm these people. This is really no little kindness. This is indeed great kindness. And to kindle a fire in rain. I don't know if you've ever tried to light a fire in rain, but these people were able to do that, kindle a fire in rain in the winter, and to be able to show hospitality to people really that they really shouldn't have shown hospitality to. And the lesson really is to us, that is, we ought to be a kind people, because you don't know what people have been through, what kind of day they're having, what kind of week they're having, what kind of issues that they are going through. Paul and the prisoners had been through the storm of the sea, and they struggled for days on end just to get to the Isle of Melita. Essentially, they had to crash land on this island, but they encountered kind people. You know, I believe that the church should be the Melita for people as they experience a crash landing into our little island. So the truth is, we ought to be kind to people because we just don't know what they are going through to get to us. Secondly, I want us to look at the character of Paul. It says, if we go back to the text, in verse number 3, and when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. I want us to know the character of Paul, an apostle, a person who has gone out and done several missionary trips, planted churches. He is actively involved in ministry, a preacher of the word. But he's not so arrogant. He's not so caught up to where he can't do menial tasks. Paul is demonstrating something that is needed in leadership today, both in secular and spiritual spaces. We need leaders who don't think that they are above doing menial tasks. No matter where you go in God and where you go in ministry, you have to be always willing to do something, sometimes the very fundamentals and basic things in order to keep ministry going. The text says that he put the wood in the fire, and that is when he got bit. Paul was simply trying to help. He was just trying to participate. And in the process of him trying to participate, he got hurt or he got bit. You know, sometimes as Christians, when you try to help a situation, we get hurt. Have you ever tried to give somebody some advice? You're just trying to help, but in turn, you try to bite your head off. Even in ministry, you might set out to help someone, but in the process, you get hurt, although you have the best of intentions. If people get a bad understanding of your heart or what you are trying to do, they respond in a negative way. But notice as well that the viper shows up when Paul helps in building the fire. The snake was on the island the whole time, but as soon as Paul takes the wood to help build the fire, he gets bitten. They don't show up until you start building something. And as long as you aren't doing nothing, then there are no stakes around. But the minute you start to get to work, you show up. The minute you start to get ready to do God's business, obstacles start coming in the way. The snake had 275 other people to bite. But the one who puts the wood in the fire, that's the one that the snake chooses to bite. You see, the snake had other options, other prisoners. The devil doesn't bother people that are not doing anything for his kingdom. The snake bit him because he was building something that was going to kill the snake. And because the snake bit him because he was building something that was going to kill the snake. And because when he shook the snake off, he shook it off into the fire. And therefore the fire was going to kill the snake. So the snake is trying to kill him before he builds something that will kill the snake. And that's why the snake is biting you. Because what you are trying to build is going to take out the enemy. So Paul gathers a bundle of sticks. And out of the bundle of sticks, there's a snake inside one of the bundles of sticks. It wasn't just any snake, but a poisonous snake. And the snake takes an opportunity to bite Paul. And when the snake bites Paul, the people start murmuring and talking among themselves. And they say that he was a murderer and that God was punishing him. It's right there in the text. It says in verse number 4, when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang onto his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt, this man is a murderer, whom though he had escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. So the people start murmuring and talking among themselves. And they say, well, he has to be a murderer. And that God was taking vengeance or punishing him. He had escaped the sea, but the snake is going to kill him. You know, and I try not to judge the people of Malta because, after all, these people were kind to the prisoners. But isn't it interesting that their kindness turns to skepticism the moment that something negative happens to Paul? After all, he's on a ship with a bunch of prisoners, so he must be guilty. So they began to say that he is a murderer and that he must deserve this. It's quite likely that the people of Malta had seen this type of snake before and had seen the effects of the bite. And it's also a fair assumption that since they saw Paul being among the prisoners that ended up in Melita, that is obvious that the gods had exacted judgment on Paul. They're essentially saying that he deserved this, or that it was indeed karma. You know, sometimes people form judgments of people without knowing them. Have you ever had people say that my blood just like ain't taken? You know nothing about the individual, but my blood just ain't taken. We need to be people who are not quick to judge people without knowing the facts first. And these people of Malta, they were guilty of that. They were saying, well, he's among the prisoners, so he must be a prisoner himself. He must be guilty as well. And that's why the snake bite him. And that God is going to exact judgment upon him. Verses number 3, verses number 4 to verses number 6, it says, when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on to his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he had escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth him not to live. And he shook the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Howbeit, they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead, suddenly. But after they had looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. I want us to recognize that we may be bitten, but God controls what seeks to kill us. So yes, Paul gets a snake bite by reaching for the wood to warm himself. And some scholars have said that he did not notice a snake because snakes sometimes stiffen in cold conditions. So the snake found a way to blend in to its environment. So Paul reaches thinking that the environment is safe, and he ends up with a venomous snake attached. But snakes don't know that God has the ability to control their venom. So what I've learned is that snakes can bite, but you don't have to die because God controls what seeks to kill you. Let's take a moment to assess the situation or the condition by which the snake attached itself. The text says that it was raining and that it was cold outside. So God, watch this, created the condition for the snake to strive just so that he can control its venom in front of everybody. What I've learned is that God will allow snakes to show up and allow snakes to bite just to show us that he controls the situations that would ordinarily kill us. I believe that this text is about the control of God. It's about God's ability to control every facet and every asset of our lives. It's about his sovereign power to make sure that his children will be all right all the time. God grants the promise of his protection and the power of his provision. We see God's protection in verse 5 and verse number 6 because the snake bites them. And of course, the people are watching and waiting for him to die because they're saying, they've seen this kind of viper attack or bite people before. It's a venomous viper. And they know that within a matter of minutes or hours that people will fall down dead. But strangely, Paul just shakes it off. And could I tell you that some things that we need to just shake off? Just like Paul shook off this viper. Some things that happen to us, we need to shake off. Sometimes I believe as Christians that we are too thin-skinned and we allow things to affect us that really shouldn't affect us. And Paul uses the example of this snake. He just shakes it off and he continues doing God's work. And sometimes in ministry, things might happen. We may be bitten, but we can just shake it off. And don't be deterred by the things that happen to us. Because indeed, God is in control. God is in charge. In the book of Mark 16 and verse number 18, Mark chapter number 16 and verse number 18, it says that they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. I see God's promise of protection on Paul. That though he says they may take up serpents, he says, and drink any deadly thing, he says, it shall not hurt them. So when Paul didn't die from this poisonous snake, watch what the people said. Well, first they said, he's a murderer. But now they switched it. And they said that he is a god. Notice how quickly people can change their minds. They change their minds very quickly when the perception did not work out. Notice how people cast aspirations on you that would suggest that what you're going through, that this bad time, because you deserve it, and that God is issuing his vengeance to you. But when you don't die, then when they thought that you would die, they said that you must be a god. I don't know about Paul, but it's several times in the scriptures, Paul's actions, people note to him that he's a god. In the book of Acts, chapter number 14, and I'll just give you one, in the book of Acts 14, verse number 8 down to verse number 12. Acts chapter 14, from verse number 8 down to verse number 12. Acts 14, verse 8 to 12. It says, and there sat a certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him, and perceived that he had faith to be healed. He said with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet. And he leaped and walked. And when the people saw that what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. And they called Barnabas Jupiter, and Paul he called him Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. Paul shows his humility, that he is just an instrument of God. He doesn't try to rob God of his glory. And so as leaders, and even as Christians, this is a valuable lesson. All glory and honor belongs to God. So yes, they call him a God, but he recognized, hey, I'm not a God. All glory and honor belongs to God. And sometimes leaders, we try to rob God of his glory and his honor. And we need to be careful that we give God his glory and his honor, because he alone is worthy of all glory and all honor. So their perception of God's intervention did not come with interpretation of the events. They interpreted the events based on their knowledge and limited perception. You know, I've learned that sometimes you have to be okay with the way that people perceive you. Sometimes you have to let people formulate whatever thoughts they have of you, because their thoughts are informed by their experiences. And people have limited and skewed thoughts because they have limited and skewed opinions. But what I like about this is that Paul's experience, or Paul's snake bite, did not limit the power that God gave him and had for Paul in his life. How do we know this? Well, look at verses number 7 to verses number 9. It says, in the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, others also, which had diseases in the island, came and were healed. Paul was not upset, annoyed, or bothered by the people's incorrect opinion of him. He does not allow them to refuse doing good on the island. He exercises and walks in the power and authority despite the people's misunderstandings of who he is. Because snake bites serve as an elevator to your escalation. In other words, if it were not for the snake bite, folks would not have gotten blessed on that island. If it were not for the snake bite, the people would not have never seen a miracle. So what I recognize is that sometimes snake bites are not for you. Sometimes it is for other people. Paul didn't get free from slavery. He didn't even get the proper perspective of who he was. Paul only got the opportunity to bless someone else because a lot of times snake bites are not for you. They are for the people that are watching you. So as you hold up your arm and dangle that snake in front of everybody, that's a declaration that God controls the venom in my life. It's interesting that the same hand that was bitten is now the same hand that is blessing. In verse number 10, it says, who also honored him with many honors. And when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. So after Paul heals Publius' father, after he heals all the folks that are lining up to see and to be blessed and healed, the same folks who are credited his rough time in life to be that of a murderer, the same folks who say that he must be a god, are the same folks that show up and give thanks and appreciation to Paul. Question: if they were barbarians and didn't speak the same language, and the text would suggest that they were idol god worshippers, being pagan in their beliefs, somehow with their language barrier and the barrier in their religion, somehow they still found a way to say thank you. Surely you and I are better than the barbarians. Somehow we can say thank you. We are in a tough time this year. Some may have lost jobs or may lose their job, but somehow you can still say thank you. Maybe you feel like you have been bitten by a snake and that the venom is going to eventually take you out, but somehow you can still say thank you. You can say thank you to God because God controls the snake bite. He controls the venom. So yes, he was bitten by the snake, but he didn't die because God controls the snake's venom. You know, it's interesting in this passage here that these people were able to display a level of love, not understanding the language barriers, not understanding religious barriers, but they're able to show love unto Paul and to the rest of the prisoners. And, you know, I believe that love is a language that knows no barriers. You know, if we indeed show people love, that we can cross all the barriers and all hurdles. Because love is indeed a language that everybody understands. In fact, in John 3:16, it says, so God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So I believe that love is a universal language. And I believe that indeed, if we indeed show love, we can indeed be able to win people over by that language of love. So this passage indeed has some wonderful thoughts. And you know, as I continue to read it there, these are just some of the thoughts that I was able to pull out from this passage. But I want us to recognize this, that yes, the snake may indeed bite us, but we indeed are not killed. And we are not killed because God controls the venom of the snake. He set up the environment so that he may be able to receive the honor, the glory, and the praise. This morning, I believe that our church is the island of Malta, and that we need to show love to those who crash into our island. We need to indeed be hospitable, just like they were hospitable and showing kindness, that we need to do the same. Secondly, that we don't jump to conclusions without knowing the facts. Too many times we see people and we say that we jump to conclusions without knowing the facts. We need to be a people that take time to know the facts before we jump to conclusions. And then we recognize as well that God, Satan only attacks when you're trying to build. If you're already outside, he doesn't bother with you. But when you're trying to build something for God is when vipers and snakes attack. And we need to be careful that we don't let those things deter us. Those bites of the vipers deter us from doing God's will, because it's all part of the plan. God has given us the power because he controls the sting, or he controls the venom. So yes, let the vipers bite, but we control, or God controls this thing. And we need to be able to, just like Paul, shake it off and continue to do the will of God. I hope this passage here has brought some enlightenment to you, as it has brought to me. And the lesson is yours this morning as we sing a song of invitation.